welcome. I'm Mike Thonis. This is Chris Crowley. He and I did the Zoom versions of this. It's calling it a different version is not quite right because this is a field trip is very different than a presentation, but you'll see. Chris is a natural-born naturalist and runs all around town. You can correct me if I got any of this wrong, and pays a lot of attention, takes photos, and has. And to me, that's the most sincere geologist, is the one that learns it on his own or her own. I, on the other hand, have an undergraduate degree from Syracuse University. I'm very proud to say that, in geology, one of the better earth science departments. And then I got a master's degree in geology here in Boston. And then I went to the dark side, got a business degree. Stayed on the dark side for quite a while, but I'm back on the bright side now, and I'm doing mostly geology. I still do some investment work, but I'm mostly doing geology, writing about it, and doing a little bit of this, and it's fun. And I I was in Death Valley earlier on a field trip sponsored. I didn't, not my own, but the Geological Society of America had a field trip in Death Valley. I went on that. The point is that I love it, and maybe. I guess you would have figured it out anyhow. So what's going on here? So I always think the field trips start best. Well, maps on a car. That's, any of you who have done a geology field trip, there's always maps taped to a car. So I'll tell you, these maps, don't stare too hard at these maps yet. These maps are both really old. They actually, this is 1975. This is the bedrock one. This is their superficial one. Like, this is the loose stuff on top of the bedrock. This is really just on top of that. I think it's exactly the same quadrangle. And this is probably also 1974. They actually did the superficial one first. Kind of the way we did the Zoom meetings. Because, you know, chronologically, the bedrock's first. The sand, gravel, glacial things are second, but whoever did these, different authors. Oh, it's actually Nelson in both cases. Well, he was apparently a broad-gauged person. Because usually in geology today, nobody who does bedrock knows anything about, they know very little about superficial. The people who do superficial know very little about bedrock. In fact, today, it's so specialized, like everything else in our world, that somebody who knows a lot about granite probably doesn't know much about conglomerate. So, kind of the fun thing about a trip like this is that we all get to talk about it all like it's equal, you know. And so, what's going on here, and then I'll refer back to the maps. But what's going on here is that you are standing on a really major fault. People have asked me a couple times, did it generate earthquakes? We'll talk a minute about when it happened. Actually, let me say one thing first. Everyone thinks in geology, a lot of people think in geology that all the answers, like in every science, like the answers are pretty much done and we're talking about details. But there are actually really big open questions that nobody's just gotten around to looking at yet. So we have this fault zone running through here, and I'll describe it in more detail in a second. Actually, on the map, it's here. It's right there, that difference between the pink and the other. And this fault zone.
Point to Wellesley on the map?
Yeah. Oh, so Wellesley is here. That's Wellesley. So there's a very faint boundary line. It's basically here. We're standing right here. Okay. And I'll tell you a bit. We're standing right here. That is there. This is there. So. But I'll just say it in words. So there's a fault zone that runs through here. It runs basically along the tracks, although when you get into town, the tracks veer off. If you're going that way, they veer off to the right. The fault line kind of goes through Morse's Pond. I think that's right. Actually, it's on the other side of Lake Waban. But the train tracks go around on the side of Waban Pond. The fault actually is where Lake Waban is. But anyhow, basically, this fault, it's really long. I mean, for this kind of fault, it's an up-down fault. So it's not like the San Andreas, which is, you probably read this side by side. This is up-down. That's the upside. This is the downside. But don't be fooled by the fact that that's higher. I'm not saying it because that's topographically higher. It could be topographically lower. But the rock type and the fact that it's up makes it high. And here, the rock type, plus the fact that it's fallen, makes it lower. But we'll come back to that. This fault starts in Natick somewhere, and goes, I think, all the way to like Lynn. So, and that side of it is generally higher topographically, and I'll give you examples. So here you see it's Wellesley. Well, this is all Wellesley Hills, but that side is the granite side. It's higher. If you keep going, go by the golf course, right? It's higher. If we're going that direction, it's higher to the left. Belmont Hill. Ever go up Route 2? You're going up the fault. Now the fault has gotten eroded and there's other kinds of materials. So it seems more gradual than just, than just a fault. But you're basically going up the fault zone when you go up Route 2. So Belmont Hill, Wellesley, this part of Wellesley Hills, and it just keeps going on and on and on. And it's got different names, and nobody's settled on what it is. Basin fault, border fault, northern border fault, boundary fault. So I guess it always has the word B in it. It's the B fault. And I don't know what they called it here, but they call it here the basin fault. Okay. So what's happened actually is you've got this fault, and this is the downfallen side. A big, from here all the way to Westwood, it's fallen. All the rocks here have fallen. And there, they have risen. And that fault, for that much, they know from borings that the throw on this fault is at least a mile. It's probably like 2 miles. So that side and this side, 2 miles displaced. And which is pretty big. Although if you think about like the Rocky Mountains, think about the Front Range, which is almost the same thing. The Front Range, it's before it eroded, it was probably 4 or 5 miles. So this is fault. It had to have been very earthquakes all the time. Anywhere from 5 to 7s. They would wake you up, and pieces of the highlands would fall down and I don't know, hurt things, but bury things. So that's the key in this town, is that we've got two different things going on. We've got a highland, we've got a lowland, that kind of rock. Now, what is that rock over there? That's that's called the Dedham granite. Sometimes I see Dedham granodiorite. No one says that anymore. It's a Dedham granite, the Dedham granite. And I'm going to hand around some pieces of it. Here we go. This is the Dedham granite. It's characteristically pink and white. And if you look at it, you'll see pink, chalky pink. You'll see chalky white, and you'll see very crystalline, like a very crystalline. It wants to be clear. It's kind of a dirty, clear, glassy thing. And what you're looking at is the pinky thing, I think, is potassium feldspar. The whitish is sodium calcium feldspars. You know the word is feldspar. That's a mineral. A mineral is just a chemical compound found in nature. Okay, it's like it's just natural. So feldspars are very common. In fact, most of the earth is made out of feldspar. It breaks down into things like calcium carbonate that makes limestones and everything else, but most of the earth is feldspar. So you've got feldspar, one kind of feldspar, another kind of feldspar, and you got quartz. And what makes granite is that it's half quartz, half feldspar, half quartz, roughly. I'll say in the rocks, this is the Dedham. We're standing right here, Wellesley Hills. The train track runs kind of like, I think it runs kind of like this. But right where we are right now, the train track is on top of the fault. That's not unexpected, because fault zones tend to erode, and maybe not that's why the train track's here, but it's why all this infrastructure is here, the roads. I mean, it creates a natural valley, and very often streams will, like if you go to Wellesley Farms, which is here somewhere, the fault zone is in a valley that a very active stream runs through. It's kind of fun to go over there. Just watch out for the poison ivy. But yes.
So you said that Lake Wobbin is part of the fault?
So a Wobbin.
Not Lake Wobbin.
You mean the town of Wobbin?
No, I mean the lake.
Lake Wobbin?
The fault goes,
Oh, Lake Wobbin. I'm sorry.
The fault goes.
The fault goes just to the edge of Lake Wobbin.
So
So
what
like
I was
Route
trying to figure out is,
16.
so Lake Wobbin is low, right?
Well, it
Where's
is.
the high part?
It is the fault zones as low areas are. In this case, the fault zone is more that there's a high area and then there's a plateau. Now, the reason why it doesn't look like a plateau is got to do with superficial. There's a couple of drumlins here that make up the other side of Wellesley Hills. I always think Wellesley Hills is kind of cool geologically because it's two very different kinds of hills. It's hard granite highlands that don't erode very well, so they're still there. That makes that side of Wellesley Hills, and then you've got glacial drumlins on that side that make up. So Wellesley Hills is actually A and B, okay, or B and A, depending on which side you live on, right? And so yes.
Drumlin is,
What's that?
a drumlin is.
Okay, and so a drumlin, and you see on this map, well, you can't see it too well, but we had a photo in the Zoom thing, but a drumlin is a huge mound of sand. So Margus Hill, where Babson is, over by Wellesley College, where the school is, Massachusetts Bay. Those big, they're just sand. You drill a hole in them, you just hit sand until you hit the Roxbury underneath them. And if you kept drilling, a couple miles down, you'd hit the Dedham granite.
And the drumlins are formed. If you think of the glacier as like a giant bulldozer that was carrying all that material, it was when it finally receded. These are the big pockets that are left behind. They don't know exactly
how it happens.
What the mechanism is, but somehow that all of that ice is pushing all of that stuff from further north, and then it stops moving forward, and there are these big oval hills that are left behind. And if the glacier had gone for another 200 years, maybe they would be in different spots, but that's where it...
Yeah, that's exactly right. They're ubiquitous, upstate New York is covered in them. Massachusetts has dozens of them. All the islands in Boston Harbor, I think all of them are, if they got any topography, are drumlins that have been flooded by the bay. We have 7 of them. I just counted. We have 7 of them here in town. They're just these giant mounds of sand. People build houses on them. And they're not great for planting things in because the water just drains right out of them. There's nothing to hold the water up. Sometimes there'll be a little thin layer of clay, kind of hold it up. But they're beautiful, They got a different kind of tree on them than here.
So they stop out further south, like if you head towards south up in the U.S., they're...
The glacier, there were many glaciations over the last 2.5 million years. The whole thing is called now, they used to think there were separate ones, but they now know the glacier is just coming and going for the last 2.5 million years. That's called the Pleistocene. And even though we say now we're in the Holocene, like somehow we're out of it, we really don't know. Glacial warming may for sure make us out of it, but the Holocene, and it's debated. A lot of people don't like calling it the Holocene. They like calling it the Anthropocene because humans were here. But yeah, the Pleistocene, 2.5 million years, glacier came, basically what's right now in Greenland just got deeper and deeper and wider and wider. It squeezes out like silly putty. You ever take a ball of silly putty, leave it on the counter, next morning it's flat? That's exactly what the glacier did. It piles up in Greenland and Hudson Bay, oozes out, and oozed its way, to answer your question now, there were a couple of places where it hit the maximum. Here in New England, that was Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, Long Island, northern Pennsylvania, St. Louis. It's really funny. The arch in St. Louis is built on the very edge of where the glacier stopped, and the glacier was dumping out sand like it did here, and that's where the arch is. It continues all the way to the Rockies. Yellowstone was glaciated with the ice cap. Further south in the mountains, there were alpine glaciers, but the ice cap itself, there they call it the Pinedale or the Fraser, the Bull. But all of those, here we call it the Wisconsinan and the Illinoisan. I don't know if you've heard those words. Geologists love to give names to everything, everything, and they're always based on a place. Like the Dedham, first identified, first described from samples in Dedham, Mass. The Roxbury, you can guess. So you can look at the maps. This is there. This is here. And the same thing with the glacial map, or the superficial map. The drumlins are here. Up here in the highlands, we don't get drumlins, and nobody really knows how drumlins happen, but for some reason here, they just didn't want to happen up there. They wanted to happen down here. There are more drumlins as you go south, because every time the glacier, what they do know about drumlins is that drumlins happen where the glacier hangs and maybe melts, kind of goes back and forth over a few hundred yards, kind of hangs for, when I say hangs, like hangs for 500 years, hangs. And then you get drumlins. But no one really knows the mechanism. We also have in this town eskers. We're not going to see any today, but these are those long, sinuous things. Pretty good idea how those happen. Under the glacier, there are streams. Have any of you been on a glacier, stood on a glacier? Remember those big wormholes? They're called moulins. There's these holes where the water, the guides always don't want to bring you there because if you fall in there, you're gone forever. You're entombed. But there's these places on the top of the glacier that during the summer when the glacier is melting, the water doesn't come melt down the glacier. It whirlpools down these holes, and they're about this big around. Some are huge, some are small. And the water just goes whipping down these holes to the bottom of the glacier and then follows like its own stream bed under the glacier. And Chris did a great job of describing this, I remember in the Zoom meeting. Basically what happens is all the sand and gravel that's coming off the top of in the glacier goes down into that stream and just piles up under the glacier on that stream bed, eventually choking it off, but leaving that mound of sand. So when the glacier melts away, you got this nice mound of usually fairly fine-grained sand. You won't have the coarse stuff. The finest grained sand is in the drumlins. The medium-grained stuff is in the eskers, and things called moraines. Part of Cape Cod, Long Island, got moraines. Those are more bouldery. History thing is really quick. First thing that happens 800 million years ago, maybe 900 million years ago, all of this, and I mean from Maine, from Newfoundland, all the way down to Florida, there's an offshore island arc called Avalonia. I don't know if you've heard of that. Geologists call it Avalonia. And it's volcanic, but it's all, it's here for hundreds of millions of years. So the volcanoes happen, they break down, granites happen, they break down, and you end up with these beautiful sand beaches that are not just beaches, but they run way out into the ocean. And eventually they turn into rock. It seems like that always happens to sand. And you get a rock called the Westboro. There's none exposed in Wellesley, but we do know, we kind of know, that there's a big chunk of the Westboro over by the lakes, over by Morse's Pond and Lake Waban. It's unfortunately in people's backyard. Chris has been trying really hard to take a photo of a Westboro outcrop, but it's all apparently in people's yards or cellar holes or.
So now with lots of no trespassing signs. So I'll make my way on there eventually.
Yeah, okay. So this is a rock called, it's a Westboro quartzite. It's a quartzite. You've seen it in countertops. It starts off as a quartz sand beach. It eventually gets buried enough that the lower layers turn into rock, and the rock is called initially a sandstone, but when it gets more and more compressed, it turns into quartzite. So it goes quartz sand, sandstone, quartzite. So that's a light metamorphic rock. Some of the you can see a lot. By the way, if you actually want to see Westboro, go over to Wayland, okay? Or actually, we have an erratic of it, a glacial chunk of it, made its way from probably Wayland over to Cronks, and it's a big slab of it is sitting right there in the woods. All right, so what happens then is more volcanism, more igneous activity, and granites start forming right in the Westboro. And what they do know from doing chemical studies is that the Dedham has a lot of the Westboro signature in it. So Westboro was not only being evaded by the molten granite, but the molten granite was absorbing, melting some of the Westboro and including it inside itself. So initially this was all Westboro, and now we've got this little piece left because the whole thing was invaded by the Dedham granite. It's a new engine, new set of cars. Oh, here's the old set. I was never so lucky. So all those years I took the trade, I never got the new one. I was always on ones that had the graffiti on them. Looks like this one had graffiti on it. Going all the way to Worcester. Okay, so first the Westboro. Well, first sand beaches that turn into the Westboro quartzite. And then up through it comes the granite, the Dedham granite. It dissolves into it some of the Westboro, and other places it just finds its way around it. That's why you find pieces of the Westboro. By the way, when you find a piece of the Westboro inside the Dedham, that's called in geology a xenolith, a foreign rock. So there's bodies of Westboro floating around this Dedham, but mostly it's Dedham from western Massachusetts all the way to, what did I say, Cape Cod. Then what happens is, that's still pretty high, big, rough land, like the Tasman River Basin in New Zealand, like Lord of the Rings, the first episode where they're walking along the top. That's what this looked like. This looked like New Zealand. I'm not exaggerating. This looked like New Zealand. And right here, you would have been standing in a braided river, you know, one of these complicated river systems, and you would have been looking up at these snow-capped peaks 20,000 feet high. I mean, I don't know precisely, but you would have been looking up at this, I mean, it's beautiful now. It was beautiful then. And that was about 600 million years ago. But then that landscape, just as is happening now in New Zealand, boulders are rolling off, getting in the river, rolling around, turning into these boulders that are Dedham granite boulders. And pieces of the Westboro are also breaking off, getting smoothed. And so if you look at the Roxbury, and they're ending up in this basin, and if you look at the Roxbury, it's got in it, like those samples, it's got in cobbles of Dedham, and it's got in it cobbles of Westboro. So we kind of, no one was ever fooled about that. They've always known or felt that the Roxbury derived from the Dedham and the Westboro, and therefore was younger. But they used to think the ages were about 300 million years ago. Everything's been doubled. We know from using uranium lead dating that these rocks are twice as old as they thought when they made these maps. And it helps to know about plate tectonics, which they didn't really know. They were just beginning to figure out. Okay, now last part of the story, and then we got to go look, is that what happens is the Roxbury forms, and that's about 590 million, let's say, years ago. And then basically nothing happens until 2.5 million years ago with the Pleistocene glaciation. Now, things are happening all around us, but they weren't happening here. I mean, coal beds were forming in Rhode Island and in Worcester, but there's no coal beds in Wellesley. So I'm sure it was warm and humid, but it was pretty quiet for a long time. And then it glaciated, and drumlins on top of everything else. Okay, let's go look at something.
Sure.
All right. Any questions? All right. And yes, undoubtedly there were earthquakes. Good ones, lots of them. This thing has been inactive for millions of years.
So don't worry.
Well, you know, sometimes they reactivate. So I don't want to make any promises.
The one thing that did happen in that interim period that I think is pretty neat, and you can see signs of in Wellesley, is at different times the land was kind of expanding and breaking apart. So 600 million years ago is before Africa smushed into very near Wellesley.
Well, that's,
Morocco,
yeah.
Likely was. So first it came together, and then as it broke apart again, that you get this stretching, which is one of the reasons I think that we have in the Dedham granite, you have so many of the big dikes of black rock or very gray rock that's completely different from the Dedham, and you can see a yard long or a 30-foot long area that got something came up and filled in that space because the continents were breaking apart again, very likely. And there's a few different periods where that happened. So when you see an individual dike, you don't know if is this because this is when Wellesley broke apart from or northeast broke apart from Africa, or is it some other particular time? There's a few times where a lot of that was going on. It would be happening underground, so it's not that that's a volcano that was spurting up these sheets, but it's eroded down now. Those giant.
I left that out. Yeah, that's important to say. Have some of you heard that the St. Mary's Cemetery, is that the cemetery?
Yeah.
Has got a volcano in it. Well, that's a big exaggeration, really, because what's got in it is one of these intrusions called a diabase dike. I've got here. You can. There you go. We'll send this way. This is diabase. Diabase is a basalt, but the grains are big enough to see. Basalt's microscopic. It's basically like a lava that comes up through, or igneous magma that comes up through these cracks. It's all over Wellesley, including at the cemetery, but including everywhere here in the hills, places out here in the Roxbury. And as Chris said, there seems to be 2 generations of it. One of them which happened while all of this was happening, another one which happened about 200 million years ago when the continents were breaking apart. It's very characteristic of rifting. When things are pulling apart, you can kind of picture it, right? The rocks are pulling apart and the lava way down deep comes up in the cracks.
Whatever that material is that's there. But if we were doing a walk on that side of town, every street would be named Oak Cliff Road and Rocky Ledges and Cliff Road and West Cliff Road, and it's because of all that fabulous granite that you see there. So now let's take a walk over and
Please, everybody, be
get
very careful. These trains, they just sneak up on you.
yeah. So we are going to cross the track. There is a pedestrian walkway that we'll go across, but.
Okay, so you want to do what I did? Okay. So we'll
Yeah, the west part was sand, and it already turned into a solid rock before. It's probably started melting. Yeah. Melting its way. Yeah, it looks dark to you. It's because the train runs through here every day.
You call it Dedham. There's virtually identical granite like this all over the world, I assume.
So there are, but they may have been created at different times. And even in Massachusetts, I think there are a couple of different, at least a couple, maybe more.
There's hundreds of different granites formed at different times.
Yeah. So if you look at Cape Ann, I believe that was like 400 million years ago.
Right.
Although, again, as Mike was saying, the dates everyone has been redoing now that they've figured out with the lead uranium dating. They've done 2 things. One, that gives you a great, accurate picture of when did the uranium get trapped in that rock. Okay, so that's when it was likely formed. But when they first started the technology, they needed lots of a sample, and they were almost always or often were taking xenoliths in with that, so they would get some kind of crazy average date. They've been getting better and better at being able to date tiny pieces of rock, so they can do a whole bunch of tiny pieces of rock and say, okay, yeah, there's 90% of these tiny pieces of rock show that it was 600 million years ago, and then we've got this one that's from 700 million years ago. Okay, well, that must have been from some earlier thing that got trapped in there.
And this is because there's some tiny bit of uranium in these rocks?
Yes.
Yes.
All igneous rocks have a little bit of uranium in them, and it's converting into lead. Yeah. And so if they can find an igneous rock, they can date it. And if you can see its relationship to sedimentary rocks, you might be able to confine the ages of the sedimentary rocks. they're constantly working on new techniques to do everything. They're actually able now to date glacial deposits, sand, using various, variations on these, on the whole isotope decay thing. But yeah, these are your lead, uranium to lead, and to the question about granite, I mean, Massachusetts probably has several hundred. I grew up on the Fitchburg Pluton, which is granite. There's the Milton, New Hampshire, but it's in Massachusetts. Down in Connecticut, there's the Alaskite. I mean, Connecticut, Rhode Island. I mean, there's got to be 100 different ones. This is one of the bigger ones, and this is not unlike. When it gets big like this, they call it a batholith. Go figure. A batholith sounds big, and other examples of batholiths, granite batholiths, are the Sierra Nevada. The whole Sierra Nevada, Mount Whitney, same thing as this, and it just up in Canada, the bugaboos are granite batholiths, sizable, probably about the size of this. Younger, still very rugged. This one time this was like being, either New Zealand or the bugaboos or something crazy.
Or like Yosemite with those granite cliffs.
Yosemite, thank you. Well, Yosemite is part of the Sierras, but Yosemite. They were probably here in the Boston area, places that today we would go on vacation. Like Yosemite, which is amazing. You been there? Yeah, it's amazing.
So, am I understanding that the Westboro is a sedimentary rock?
Turned into a metamorphic rock. It's so old, it's been there so long, that it went from loose sand to sandstone, that's sedimentary, to quartzite, which is metamorphic.
From pressure.
From maybe pressure of burial, probably mostly burial. Yeah, it's lightly metamorphosed.
And then granite is igneous, and that's how it percolated through the Westboro?
Right.
Is that okay? Now I understand.
It melts its way up from deep down. From deep down off the mantle of the earth. It works its way up. Usually has volcanoes at the surface, and it's granite. So if you go to like Yellowstone, and Yellowstone's all volcanic ash and lava flows and things on top, but way down deep, there's a granite magma chamber that has not yet solidified. It has not yet turned into a solid rock. It's still magma. And it takes anywhere from 30,000 years to 100,000 years for a magma chamber, a granite magma chamber, to turn into solid rock. It takes that long for it to cool down because it's like a big thermos. It's way down deep. And this was all covered in rock at one time. And this is probably all covered in Westboro. And it's been eroded away, except for a few places like over on the west side of town. Chris, what do you think?
I think we're good.
I
think we're good.
Touch it anyhow. This granite body, if you drill down, goes down 10, 20 miles. It goes down 10 miles.
Wow.
I mean, it's solid granite.
So some of us may have taken our children on a field trip to this pudding stone.
The Roxbury conglomerate is
that
people
what
call it
it
the
is?
Boston pudding stone.
All right, so that's the same stuff?
Same stuff.
Because there's some
nickname
up
is
there.
Boston
There's-
pudding stone.
All right, there's some up there.
I don't think there's any up here, but if there is, I'd love to know about it because that would.
What's that little notch up off of Cliff Road up there?
I don't know.
Maybe it's something else.
There's a notch down there.
No, this is definitely.
You mean the slide, Devil's Slide?
Yeah, Devil's Slide.
No, that's actually a diabase, one of those things that Chris was describing. A diabase, sort of basalt-like lava that squeezes its way up through some cracks.
So that's not pudding stone. We'll be looking at some different kinds of pudding or Roxbury conglomerate today. That as we
You can
take
call it
the
pudding
next
stone.
walk.
It's okay. You can call it.
But that again is called
That is not the pudding stone. That is a diabase. If you want basalt, diabase, dike. Dike being a vertical squeeze through. When lava way down deep tries to squeeze itself up. And by the way, it's coming from 10, 15 miles down. When it tries to squeeze its way up, actually somebody forcefully pushes the rocks to the side or crashes its way through and then solidifies. That's called a dike. If it happens to do it on the horizontal instead of vertical, that's called a sill. The Palisade sill is exactly the same rock and same thing as our Devil's Slide dike.
And just the last thing I'll say is if you picture yourself as the engineer that was told to lay out this train track, that you had to get a train track from Boston to Worcester. You had a choice of trying to dynamite or drill your way through the granite and Wellesley, or you can do what they did, which was kind of, you want the train track to be straight, but it's a lot less work if you can go right along the boundary of this fault and go around this cliff face here. So that's what they did. They laid it around the cliff, and then as someone mentioned, there's different points. It's not all this high, and not all of the Dedham is the same elevation. So when it has eroded a little bit lower, over by Morris's Pond, maybe that's where a river long ago was coming through. They said, okay, well there we can go through and still have a decent path. So this area may have been, as we were talking about in one of the presentations, this may have been a lake, as the glaciers were retreating. This was all flat over on this side, which is the perfect, the flat lake bed, perfect place to put a train track if that lake bed has dried up. So
If you go on our next hike, which is a couple weeks from now,
yeah.
we're going to be right smack on top of the lake bed. Is that right? Well, it depends. We're going to be at Bates.
That'll be part of it.
Yeah. And we'll talk a lot more about the glacial part of it. But Chris is right. I mean, it was here. This is all sand in here, and it's in the actual rocks to show you how dramatic the rocks before the ice age, how dramatic everything was. It's 90. You don't hit rock. Well, right there on the street, you don't hit this rock again until you're 90 feet down, which is great for the town because it can put all of its sewage lines through there and its wastewater lines through there and its electricity through the. Well, they got some poles, but as Chris was saying, it's very convenient. Put a train track here.
Yeah.
We don't think this has been blasted, by the way, because you don't see any of those dynamite holes. I haven't seen any. So we think this is pretty much was here. Now this is that's Dedham, but these others are not. These are granites. That's a granite. That could be the Westwood granite, which is a variation on the Dedham. So maybe these two are the same. This is a piece of basalt. This is not from Wellesley. Could be from. There's other places. There are some basalts elsewhere in the Boston Basin. That's a nice. I love that. That's a Dedham. You can see all three of the colors, the pink, the yellow, and the quartz. The pink feldspar, the white or yellow feldspar, and the crystalline quartz. Yeah, but that's a basalt. And interestingly, I don't know what that is. That looks like a diabase. It looks like, you know what it looks like? It looks like they just grabbed whatever they could. It's like modern practices, Whatever's in the backyard.
But as we get into these neighborhoods, you're going to see a lot of retaining walls that all look the same. They look like the same kind of glacial rock. Most of this side of Wellesley is covered with glacial till. The big hills tend to be drumlins, not cliff outcrops. Till is the stuff. The glacier is like a giant conveyor belt. It was a 2 miles thick of ice filled with rocks, so it's constantly breaking stuff off, carrying it along as it moves, as the ice flows in one direction, away from the center. And then when it melted, all of that drops flat area,
Yeah.
and then we hit a big ridge of this pudding stone. So this, so if you can go right up to the wall if you want.
Is that? Oh, that's not
So-
poison ivy. That's
This is not
Virginia
poison ivy.
Virginia creeper.
So this is pudding stone here. It's not as dramatic. We're actually going to see a piece which looks much more like the one that Mike showed you, where you can
Yeah.
see every individual cobble in it. So the pudding stone, the Roxbury conglomerate kind of broadly includes both that stuff that's so dramatic, and you can say, ooh, there's a piece of Dedham, there's a piece of Westboro inside it, but it also includes other kinds of rock where it's a little tougher to see the cobbles that are in there, at least with all the moss that's on this right now.
If you can picture a braided river system, if any of you ever seen it up like in Alaska, the McKinley, is it, river? A braided river system is complex, and parts of it will have these big boulders, sometimes really big boulders. And then other places it'll be kind of muddy. Well, that all gets preserved eventually into the rock, and the muddy part isn't conglomerate, it's shale or sandstone. So when you look at the Roxbury, right here in this neighborhood, it ranges from that one outcrop we're going to look at, which is a beautiful conglomerate, to things that are more like probably a shale or a sandstone. And there's one, are we going to go up that street? Yeah, all right. So there's one you're going to see where it's actually not a conglomerate because it's got large grains in it. It's more of a gravel thing.
What would you say about this wall? Can you tell? It has so much stuff.
Moss, lots of moss.
I think that they would have not gone too far for this stone. But
Well, these are all rounded,
yeah.
which means they're glacial. So they could have just picked up off the landscape. And there's a ton of this up where we're going to be next 2 weeks from now, up near Bates School. Rounded boulders from the glacier. These are rocks that, because they're so rounded, it wouldn't surprise me if these are from Newfoundland. Certainly Quebec.
Just rolled down
And they've been in the glacier, and the glacier is a much more strenuous environment than you would think, right? You look at a glacier and it's there, but they move 10 to 100 feet a year, and when they move, they don't just if you could actually look at a cross section, there's some examples of this online, cross sections of glaciers, you'll see that they're like, the ice in it is completely contorted, like if you squeezed a whole bunch of toothpaste out on the counter. And that's what the glacier looks like. And the rocks inside that get really beat up. They get rounded. And you can almost tell how far away this came, where it originated from, by how rounded it is or isn't. These are sort of kind of rounded.